Okay, here we go.
So the 1960s saw people organizing and actively working for change both in the social order and in government. This included the student movement, the women's movement, movements for gay rights, and a push by the courts to expand rights in general. But by the end of the 1960s, the anti-war movement seemed to have overshadowed all the rest.
So the answer to number one, what were people working for? They're working for social and political change. It says the 1960s saw people working for change in society and in politics. They're trying to change the whole structure there. And then the second one says, by the end of the 1960s, what movement seemed to overshadow the rest? It is the anti-war movement.
So as you'll no doubt remember from last week, the civil rights movement began in the 1950s, if not before, but many of its key moments happened in the 60s. And this really began with sit-ins that took place in Greensboro, North Carolina.
Number three, what happened at the sit-in in Greensboro, North Carolina? University students walked into Woolworths and waited at lunch counters to be served. And while they were there, they had to practice the methods of nonviolence because they were attacked both verbally and physically.
University students walked into Woolworths and waited at the lunch counters to be served, or more likely, arrested. After 5 months of that, those students eventually got Woolworths to serve black customers. Then in 1961, leaders from the Congress on Racial Equality.
So, number four, who launched the Freedom Rides in hopes of integrating interstate buses? That is the Congress of Racial Equality. And their goal is to desegregate buses.
They launched Freedom Rides to integrate interstate buses. Volunteers rode the buses into the Deep South, where they faced violence, including beatings and a bombing in Anniston, Alabama. But despite that, those Freedom Rides also proved successful, and eventually the ICC desegregated interstate buses. In fact, by the end of the 60s, over 70,000 people had taken part in demonstrations, from sit-ins to teach-ins to marches. But they weren't all successful. Martin Luther King's year-long protests in Albany, Georgia didn't end discrimination in the city, and it took JFK ordering federal troops to escort James Meredith to class for him to attend the University of Mississippi. The University of Mississippi, America's fallback college. Sorry, I'm from Alabama. So the civil rights movement reached its greatest national prominence in 1963 when Martin Luther King came to my hometown of Birmingham, Alabama.
So, number five, the civil rights movement gained its national prominence in 1963 when Martin Luther King goes to Birmingham, Alabama. This is because you can see right here, there is massive amounts of terrorism, 50 racially motivated bombings, and that is terrorism.
Where there had been more than 50 racially motivated bombings since World War II. Television brought the reality of the Jim Crow South into people's homes as images of Bull Connor's police dogs and water cannons being turned on peaceful marchers, many of them children, horrified viewers, and eventually led Kennedy to endorse the movement's goals. Probably should mention that John F. Kennedy was president of the United States at the time, having been elected in 1960. He was assassinated in 1963, leading to Lyndon Johnson. All right, politics over. Anyway, in response to these peaceful protests, Birmingham jailed Martin Luther King, where he wrote one of the great letters in American history. Doesn't have a great name. Letter from Birmingham jail. 1963 also saw the March on Washington, the largest public...
So, number six, what is the largest public demonstration in American history? It is the March on Washington. And let's not forget, there's Dr. King, but we want to remember that both A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin are a part of this. I should have looked at this earlier. I can find A. Philip Randolph. And I know that Bayard Rustin is also one of the main organizers, but looking at this picture, I don't see him in this one, but I might be wrong.
Demonstration in American history up to that time, where King gave his famous speech, "I have a dream." King and the other organizers called for a civil rights bill.
So number seven, what do the civil rights people demand? Help for the poor, public works. So public works are things like bridges and roads and other things that the whole public can use. It also creates jobs. A higher minimum wage and
help for the poor, demanding public works, a higher minimum wage, and an end to discrimination.
And an end to discrimination in employment. So all those things are demanded by the civil rights movement and the civil rights bill.
In employment. Which eventually, in one of the great bright spots in American history, did sort of happen with the Civil Rights Act. So one reason American history teachers focus on the Civil Rights Movement so much is that it successfully...
Number 8, why do we focus on this one part? Because remember, civil rights have always been happening. But this specific time, we focus on it because it actually has both congressional and Supreme Court changes that become permanent part of our law.
Brought actual legislative change. After being elected president, John F. Kennedy was initially cool to civil rights, but to be fair, the Cold War occupied a lot of his time, what with the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs and whatnot. But the demonstrations of 1963 pushed John F. Kennedy to support civil rights more actively. According to our dear friend, the historian Eric Foner, Kennedy realized that the United States simply could not declare itself the champion of freedom throughout the world while maintaining a system of racial inequality at home.
So Mr. Kennedy here, President Kennedy, is pushed by the 1963 protests to start passing civil rights legislation. People see this brutality on TV, and then eventually the majority of the American public starts to really realize that, that they as a nation need to work for civil rights and desegregation.
So that June, he appeared on TV and called on Congress to pass a law that would ban discrimination in all public accommodations. And then he was assassinated. Thanks, Lee Harvey Oswald. Or possibly someone else, but probably Lee Harvey Oswald. So then Lyndon Johnson became president, and he pushed Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The law prohibited...
So, number 10, what does the Civil Rights Act do? It prohibits discrimination in employment, schools, hospitals, privately owned public,
schools, hospitals, and privately owned public places like...
Yes, privately owned public places like restaurants, hotels, and theaters. Also bans discrimination based on sex. And then part of this too, don't forget, was that part where it bans discrimination added later of peoples with disabilities. The only part not in this is what we're looking at in modern times, which is LGBTQ rights.
Restaurants and hotels and theaters, and it also banned discrimination on the basis of sex. The Civil Rights Act was a major moment in American legislative history, but it hardly made the United States a haven of equality. So civil rights leaders continued to push for the enfranchisement of African Americans. After Freedom Summer workers registered people in Mississippi to vote, King launched a march for voting rights in Selma.
In Selma, number 11, what's the topic? It's a march for voting rights, because although Selma is a majority African American city, I think it's something like only like 3% of its population of African Americans is voting. So it was like 51% or 50-something% African American, but only like 3% of African American voters. So they're trying to get African Americans to vote. That was number 11.
Alabama in January 1965. And again, television swayed public opinion in favor of the demonstrators. Thank you, TV, for your one and only gift to humanity. Just kidding, Battlestar Galactica. So in 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, which gave the federal government the power to oversee voting in places where discrimination was practiced. In 1965, Congress also passed the Hart-Celler Act, which got rid of national origin...
Don't forget this one. This is the Immigration Act of 1965. This is the one that opens up immigration from Asia and Africa.
Quotas and allowed Asian immigrants to immigrate to the United States. Unfortunately, the law also introduced quotas on immigrants from the Western Hemisphere. Lyndon Johnson's domestic initiatives from 1965 through 1967 are known as the Great Society, and it's possible that if he hadn't been responsible for America escalating the war in Vietnam, he might have been remembered, at least by liberals, as one of America's greatest presidents. Because the Great Society expanded a lot of the promises of the New Deal, especially in the creation of health insurance programs like Medicare for the elderly and Medicaid for the poor. He also went to war on...
So the other war that Lyndon Johnson goes against is war on poverty. And remember, this cuts poverty in half. Since then, we have had an increase in poverty, but this gets our poverty rate to the lowest it's been. I think that was during the early 70s. It got to the lowest point it had ever been. And then since then, we unfortunately have seen poverty rates rise. This is number 12.
Poverty. Never go to war with a noun. You will always lose. Johnson treated poverty as a social problem rather than an economic one, so instead of focusing on jobs or guaranteed income, his initiative stressed things like training. That, unfortunately, failed to take into account shifts in the economy away from high-wage union manufacturing jobs toward more lower-wage service jobs. Here's what Eric Foner had to say about Johnson's domestic accomplishments. By the 1990s, the historic gap between whites and blacks in education, income, and access to skilled employment narrowed considerably. But with deindustrialization and urban decay affecting numerous families and most suburbs still being off limits to non-white people, the median wealth of white households remained 10 times greater than that of African Americans, and nearly a quarter of all black children lived in poverty.
Number 13, the percent of African American kids living in poverty is 25%. 25%.
While Congress was busy enacting Johnson's Great Society programs, the movement for African American freedom was changing. Let's go to the thought bubble. Persistent poverty and continued discrimination in the workplace, housing, education, and criminal justice system might explain the shift away from integration and toward black power.
What is Black Power? Celebration of African American culture and a criticism of white oppression, and then also an empowerment of African American communities. So think about breakfast programs, self-defense, education programs, all these things about self-sufficiency that are occurring in African American communities. That our most famous would be, yes, the Black Panthers here. And they are watching to make sure that they are policing the police, as they said.
Celebration of African American culture and criticism of white suppression. 1964 saw the beginnings of riots in city ghettos, for instance, mostly in northern cities. The worst riots were in 1965 in Watts, in Southern California. These left 35 people dead, 900 injured, and $30 million in damage. Newark and Detroit also saw devastating riots.
So, number 13, the three main cities. I mean, there was riots all over, but our main ones are Watts, Detroit, and Newark. And yes, that is a ton of damage that was done in those cities.
Riots in 1967. In 1968, the Kerner Report blamed the cause of the rioting on segregation, poverty, and white racism.
So the Kerner Report, done by the Kerner Commission, this is a government investigation done during the Johnson administration. And the way that the government explains our problems are segregation, think redlining, extreme poverty in places like in the cities, that's what was motivating them to riot, and white racism. And then they were mainly focusing on what was the relationship between law enforcement and African American communities. So this is pretty rare that the government comes up and openly says that this is a problem. And they say these things, these main three things. So pretty rare moment in history when the government is saying that our big problem here is segregation, poverty, and white racism. And this is, like during the Johnson administration.
Then there's Malcolm X, who many white people regarded as an advocate for violence, but who also called for self-reliance. It's tempting to see leadership shifting from King to X as the civil rights movement became more militant, but Malcolm X was active in the early 1960s, and he was killed in 1965, 3 years before Martin Luther King was assassinated and before all the major shifts in emphasis toward black power. Older civil rights groups like CORE abandoned integration as a goal after 1965 and started to call for black power. The rhetoric of black power could be strident, but its message of black empowerment was deeply resonant for many. Oakland's Black Panther Party did carry guns in self-defense, but they also offered a lot of neighborhood services.
So the other thing, number 17, what do they offer? Neighborhood services. Think school lunch programs or breakfast programs, which fed thousands upon thousands of kids. Upon thousands of kids.